A tēnā koutou katoa i ngā rangatira o te ao katoa kanu te mi atu ki a koutou. Greetings everyone. I bring you warm greetings from a rainy day here in Aotearoa, New Zealand on a Sunday morning. I couldn't hear that introduction, but it's all good. It's probably better. The main thing to take from that introduction, I think, is one, I'm an active church member. I'm also an active Māori in our culture and with our family. So I'm active in both, very active, and trying to reconcile both, which I think reconcile quite comfortably. So I've been asked, or I'm going to talk about this definition or this notion of Lamanite identity within a New Zealand context, a Māori context. So I'll be talking about the LDS Church, the Mormon Church. I'll say LDS Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and talk about what happened to Māori. I do have a draft paper which has some detail in it. I know it's quite long and I'm prepared to cut it down, but I'm going to be talking about this in 20 minutes. So you have to bear with me. I've got a bit to cover. I hope you can hear me clearly, if that's okay. Okay, good. But welcome, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. Tavita malulele. And so can I just start with a couple of assumptions? The first is, I'm assuming you're familiar with the Bible and the whole notion of the House of Israel, as well as the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ, and the whole Lamanite Nephite narrative there, as well as LDS history and doctrine. I have to assume you have at least that base. Everyone does, because that's assumption. Those are assumptions I'll be operating on as I give my presentation. Just a couple other things, because it's important we understand context. I'll just say a little bit about New Zealand and Māori generally. So New Zealand, Māori call it Aotearoa, is at the bottom of the world, down under, as we say. It's next to Australia. I'll emphasize it's not part of Australia. We're on our own. We are a nation state, an island state, British parliamentary government. Our population at present is over 5 million. As a nation, New Zealand, set as an island state, it's actually made up of about 400 islands. But we've got two big islands, the North and South Island, and a smaller one, Shute Island, and a whole bunch of other islands too. But our population, I said, is just over 5 million. Māori today, our latest statistics, make up approximately 18% of that population. So we're almost 1 million. We are the biggest minority, as it were, in our country. For Māori, we believe our oral accounts talk about us originating into Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, into the Pacific, a place we call Hawaii or Hawaii Nui, which is in our translation, the land of the gods. Where that is debatable. We don't have time to get into that here. But anthropologists try to say Māori came to New Zealand from Polynesia approximately 1300. In terms of the churches, the first Christian church in New Zealand was in 1814. The Church Missionary Society, the Anglican Church under Samuel Marsden. Then the Methodists came, the Catholics, about 1830, and then the LDS Church, Mormon Church, came here in 1854. But they didn't work with Māori. They started working with what we call Pākehā, or Europeans, or for some of our Polynesian whānau call them Haole or Pālangis. But they initially started with the Europeans, Then there was a policy switch in 1880, and I'll pick up on that a bit later. Been going for 5 minutes already. Just the switch here. In terms of my presentation and my paper, you can read the paper and get into the deeper issues and themes. I just want to quickly mention here some of the challenges for Indigenous peoples, I believe, in the church have been an issue around policy. And I just make a distinction between policy and doctrine and policy and practice. One of the constants in life is change, and one of the only certainties in life is uncertainty. And you'll see this as you trace the history of the church with regards to peoples of color. There's these policy shifts that were sometimes tried to be masked as doctrine, but they were policy shifts. And I believe that's what's happened with Indigenous peoples, with Māori, with other Indigenous peoples in the church. But I'll share a bit more detail on that shortly. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is, in terms of policy and doctrine, what underpins colonialism is this doctrine of discovery. I'm going to assume you people know what that means, but it started or went back to the 11th century with the Crusades to the Holy Lands of these European nation states and monarchies that were all Catholic, by the way. And what they were doing was trying to reclaim the Holy Land. What was interesting was their assumptions about dealing with non-European, non-Christian peoples. They referred to them as infidels that needed discovering and saving. And they were even legitimated in doing this through law. And that was through a number of papal bulls or papal laws that in effect legitimated genocide, ecocide, ethnocide, and every other detrimental side for Indigenous peoples. And so there's these assumptions that laid the precedent for the age of imperialism and colonialism later from 1492 with the so-called discovery of the New World with Columbus and his discovery of these new peoples who he named Los Indios or Indians. Now, just carrying on from there, or actually, if I can say here, Māori as a people, we are very proud and stubborn and we're fighters. We have a tradition of being brought up in war, so on. And of course, with colonialism and all these assumptions coming to our shores, Māori fought them and we continue to fight those notions. In fact, in 1864, we had a war here between Māori and the British, and my ancestors actually fought in that war. And it was a hopeless cause, hopeless battle. We were outnumbered 300 Māori against 1,700 British and New Zealand troops. There was 300 men, women, and children. We held them off for 3 days. And on the third day, they came closer to our pa, people were surrounded, and then the general sent out one of his emissaries for Māori to surrender. The response from our people was, ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, ake, ake. Loosely translated into English, we'll fight you forever and never give up. Never, never. We'll fight forever. And that sort of characterizes our Māori pride, as it were, our Māori spirit from that battle. And in fact, with this doctrine of discovery, one of our tribes in Ngāpuhi in the north, we say when Captain Cook came here in 1769, he was lost. The British were lost and we discovered them. It's all a matter of perspective. But anyway, I'll just say this, colonialism, brothers and sisters, in effect is about displacing peoples from the sites of power. The sites of power, government, the economy, land, language, trade, religion too. And so it's about displacing them from the sites of power. And it's actually part of the human condition, goes back before the Crusades, goes out throughout humanity. But that's what's happened with colonialism post Columbus. And as part of this colonialism, yes, mission, it's about erasure, eradicating or assimilating or integrating these other peoples, but first displacing them from the sites of power. And I share this here because that's what's happened to Māori, and I'm assuming all of you other Indigenous peoples throughout our histories, and some would say in a church context too, because colonialism is about commercialization, civilization, and Christianization. Now, in a Māori context, I'm going to assert that colonialism within the church was different here. And you read my paper for the finer details. But after 1880, as I mentioned earlier, that's when the church switched its policy to work with Māori. A number of Māori tribes, not all of them, but a number of them were very highly attracted to the church, and there were a number of mass conversions, so that by 1910, between 1881 and 1910, 10% of the Māori population had been converted to the LDS church. And in my paper, I talk about why. It comes down to three key reasons. One was the timing of the LDS missionaries coming to Māori. 1880 was the end of the New Zealand wars, our civil wars. And at that time, our people lost their lands, lost a lot of their lives, were losing our culture, and there was a lot of anti-British sentiment. And then for many of them, it was almost as a anti-British colonial stance. They saw these Americans coming, said, hey, they're better than the British, so we'll go to that church. That's one reason. Also, a lot of the sectarian missionaries were complicit in the whole colonial process. Some of them were leading the soldiers into these battles against us. And so it turned our people off those churches. So that timing's one reason. A second reason, and this is why I say it's very different here in New Zealand with LDS, at least early missionaries, was what I refer to as an intercultural policy or an intercultural approach to working with Māori, which in effect was most of the LDS missionaries working with Māori were pragmatic, and they had to live in Māori communities, work with Māori, learn the language, learn the culture. In effect, they became assimilated into Māori culture. And that was a successful policy. And I'll say this up front too, that was the policy here in New Zealand from 1881 to about 1948. And that's why a lot of other Māori were attracted to the church, that intercultural approach. The other sectarian missionaries were apart. They learnt the language, but they wouldn't live with the people. They're trying to set themselves apart from Māori, but not so with our LDS missionaries. So that was a favorable approach working with our people. The other, and I've got more detail in my paper on it, is what we call matakite Māori or Māori seers, who ironically prophesied of all the, I guess, these terrible things that would happen to Māori by virtue of colonialism. We had a number of our matakite prophesy of that, but then they also prophesied that a certain church would come amongst Māori, and they gave these certain signs that were indicative of the true church for Māori. And to be frank, the LDS church, after 1881, fitted all of those signs. They fulfilled those prophecies. And I've listed 3 in my paper. I've managed to uncover about 15 of them. And I'm writing a book on this. So hopefully next year, I'm planning on finishing that when I'm on my sabbatical. And so those are in my paper. That's what attracted a lot of Māori to the church. And so I say it's different how they worked here in New Zealand as opposed to how they were working in perhaps Canada and Utah and other parts of Western United States, where they actually assimilated into our communities and became Philo Māori. And they really did. And interestingly, our matakite says actually prophesied that the missionaries would do that too. They would speak our language, learn our customs, live with our people, eat with our people, and they'd do a number of other things. So they would assimilate into our culture. Now that was the approach of the church in New Zealand. That's why it was so successful initially. In 1913, we had a contingent of Māori go to the Salt Lake City Temple, and they met with Joseph F. Smith. They actually sent a letter to him, a telegram when they got to Vancouver, to Utah, saying perhaps the children of Hagoth have returned. And then Joseph F. Smith, when he actually met them in Salt Lake City, they put on a big a meal for them and welcome ceremony for them. Joseph F. Smith actually spoke to them and said, no doubt about it, you are the people of Hagoth. And so our kaumātua at the time said, the prophet of God has spoken, and that settled it. We also had another amazing missionary, Matthew Cowley. We've got 5 minutes, right? Matthew Cowley, he was known as the missionary or the apostle of Polynesia. He was actually on the mission here in New Zealand in 1914 during World War I, and he actually helped to retranslate the Book of Mormon in 1919, the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. And then he came back as mission president, then he was an apostle. And what he always told Māori, and he'd speak to us in our language, but what he always said to us as an apostle even, was he said for us to never lose our culture, never lose your language, never lose your customs, because they are of the house of Israel. Now, there was a policy shift in 1948 after Matthew Cowley left as mission president. That was Gordon C. Young, one of Brigham Young's great-grandsons. He came here, to be frank, with a chip on his shoulder. He served a mission here in 1919, and he came here and he instituted a new policy, which was assimilation. And he abolished Māori wards. He said no Māori was allowed to be spoken in church. He said, too, that this is not a Māori church. So he did the shift. As a result of that, a lot of people, a lot of Māori left the church. A lot of them stayed too, but he was detested in New Zealand, so much so that his wife had a breakdown while she was there. The irony of it too was when he left New Zealand, he went inactive, which annoyed a lot of us Māori, a lot of our grandparents and so on. So he was a hard taskmaster that instituted assimilation, which is more colonial. But prior to that, so over 50 years in New Zealand, the church was a Māori church. Then that shifted. Fast forward to today, Māori are still very strong in the church. We claim we're the house of Israel. We're still very strong in the church, and the church now is just starting to wind back that assimilation policy. We have our first Māori church up in Kaikohe, which is all spoken in Māori. That's the first. That was 2 years ago. It's being an experiment for a lot of our other wards around New Zealand. But I guess some of the key themes to take out is, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I've run out of time, but have a read of my paper. The deeper details are there. But I guess a couple of key things here, just in terms of summarizing the church in New Zealand. First, Māori embrace the church for cultural reasons, because of our matakite, because they respected our culture and that intercultural policy. And for it to succeed today, it needs to do the same for Māori, and I believe other cultures too, other Indigenous peoples, and not sort of get stuck on this whole notion of Lamanite identity. To say, for us, we claim we were Nephites, actually, because Hagoth was a Nephite, not a Lamanite. But in saying that too, this whole identity marker is arbitrary. Even in the scriptures, it's arbitrary. It's not based on race. It's not based on ethnicity. It's actually based on faith and works. That's what it's based on, and it's arbitrary. So we don't get hung up on that. What we do focus on is we're children of the house of Israel, so we're children of covenant, people of covenant. However, in saying that, as peoples, Indigenous peoples, we're vulnerable in terms of it depends on the leadership and their policy changes and shifts. And I hate to say this, but there's that arrogant assumption that Utah culture is the gospel culture. I beg to differ and say that a lot more of our Indigenous cultures are actually closer to gospel culture, which is why a lot of the missionaries, at least the early missionaries up until 1948, embraced Māori culture and loved it. I'll also say too, in terms of color, our skin color and so on, distinguish between the curse and mark. I'm almost done. Sorry. My response to that is I believe that blossoming of the Lamanite is not actually we're going to become white. I believe it's actually our countenance and light within us. And also, my wife always says, everybody likes chocolate, right? So don't get hung up on that. In fact, we're proud of our culture and our color and so on. Be proud of our language, of our cultures, and we can reconcile them being good LDS and good Indigenous peoples. I'll finish off here, ladies and gentlemen, with a quote from our recent general conference by the prophet, Russell M. Nelson. He said this, and I quote, "The gospel net is the largest net in the world. God has invited all to come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female." I'll interject there, Lamanite, Nephite, Māoris, Dene, Navajo, Tongan, Samoan, Hawaiian, Hopi, all are alike unto Christ, male and female too. But then the prophet carries on, there is room for everyone. However, there is no room for prejudice, condemnation, or contention of any kind. There is room for everyone, brothers and sisters. I better stop there. I can keep going on, but sorry, I've run out of time. Sorry, Tavita.